6 months after the shock of Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan dominated the Pacific. The only thing standing in their way? A damaged, outnumbered, and desperate American fleet. Today, we explore the greatest naval ambush in history. A battle of intelligence versus raw power, where every move was a lethal gamble, and the fate of the entire Pacific theater hung on a single, crucial 4-minute window. This is the climax of the naval war. This is the Battle of Midway. In the spring of 1942, just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan stood at the zenith of its power. Across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, Japanese forces had achieved victories that stunned the world and exceeded even their own expectations. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, had surrendered. The Dutch East Indies, with their vital oil fields, were under Japanese control. Burma had been invaded. The Japanese had advanced thousands of miles from their home islands, creating an empire that stretched from the borders of India to the Central Pacific. And the United States, reeling from Pearl Harbor and the loss of most of its Pacific battleship fleet, appeared powerless to stop them. But in early June 1942, near a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific called Midway, the course of the Pacific War, and perhaps of world history, would be decided in a matter of minutes. This is the story of the Battle of Midway, a battle of intelligence, courage, sacrifice, and fortune that would mark the turning point of the war in the Pacific. To understand Midway, we must first understand what Japan had accomplished in the 6 months since Pearl Harbor, and what it still needed to achieve. The victories of late 1941 and early 1942 had been spectacular, but they had not eliminated the American threat. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had sunk or damaged 8 battleships, but they had missed the American aircraft carriers, which had been out at sea during the attack. These carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, USS Saratoga, USS Yorktown, USS Hornet, and USS Wasp, remained the core of American naval power in the Pacific. And in April 1942, they had demonstrated their potential danger. On April 18th, the Doolittle Raid, an audacious air attack launched from the carrier Hornet, struck Tokyo itself, dropping bombs on the Japanese capital and humiliating the Japanese military, which had promised the emperor that Japan would never be attacked. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood that the American carriers remained a mortal threat to Japan's newly won empire. As long as those carriers existed, Japan's long supply lines and exposed island bases would be vulnerable to American raids. The empire that had been won so quickly could be picked apart piece by piece if the American carriers were not eliminated. Yamamoto's solution was bold, complex, and risky. He would lure the remaining American carriers into a trap where they could be destroyed by the superior Japanese carrier force. The bait would be an attack on Midway Atoll, a small coral island approximately 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was strategically significant, serving as an American outpost guarding the approaches to Hawaii. An attack on Midway would force the Americans to commit their carriers to its defense. And when they did, the Japanese fleet would be waiting. Yamamoto assembled an enormous force for the operation. The striking power would come from the Kido Butai, the first air fleet, comprising 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sarayu, and Hiryu. These were veteran ships with experienced crews that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent operations. Together, they carried over 250 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, more than the Americans could possibly match. Supporting the carriers would be battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and a separate invasion force tasked with actually capturing Midway once American air and naval power had been eliminated. In total, Yamamoto's operation involved over 200 ships, the largest Japanese naval force ever assembled. The plan appeared flawless. The Americans, with only a handful of carriers remaining, would be forced to defend Midway. They would be outnumbered, outgunned, and caught between the invasion force approaching from the west and the carrier strike force from the northwest. The The Japanese would achieve the decisive victory that had eluded them at Pearl Harbor, destroying the American carrier fleet and forcing the United States to the negotiating table. But the plan had one fatal flaw: it was no longer secret. Deep in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a team of American cryptanalysts had been working around the clock for months, attempting to break Japanese naval codes. The unit was called Station Hypo, and it was led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant but eccentric naval officer who often worked in his bathrobe, chain-smoking cigarettes while puzzling over encrypted Japanese messages. By May 1942, Rochefort and his team had achieved a breakthrough. They had partially broken the Japanese JN-25 naval code, enough to understand the general content of messages, if not every detail. And in late May, those messages revealed that the Japanese were planning a major operation. The target was identified in the intercepts as AF, a two-letter designation whose actual location was unknown. But Rochefort had a theory. He believed AF was Midway. To confirm this, he devised an ingenious trap. He had Midway send an uncoded radio message reporting that their water desalination plant had broken down and the island was running short of fresh water. Sure enough, within days, Japanese messages were intercepted reporting that AF was short of water. AF was Midway. The Japanese target was confirmed. Commander Rochefort reported his findings to Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz, a calm, methodical Texan who had taken command after Pearl Harbor, made a decision that required tremendous confidence in his intelligence officers. He would believe the codebreakers. He would trust that Midway was the target. And he would prepare an ambush. The Japanese believed they were setting a trap for the Americans. In reality, they were sailing into one. The hunters were about to become the hunted. And the stage was set for one of the most dramatic naval battles in history, a battle that would be decided not by the size of the fleets or the thickness of armor, but by intelligence, timing, and in a matter of minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942, by sheer luck. The American carriers were putting to sea. The Japanese fleet was approaching. And at Midway Atoll, a tiny garrison prepared to face the full fury of Japanese naval air power, knowing they were the bait that would draw the enemy into American guns. Admiral Nimitz, armed with the intelligence from Station Hypo, moved quickly to prepare his ambush. Every available carrier in the Pacific would be committed to the battle. USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, were already at sea. USS Yorktown, severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, was rushed back into service after emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor. Work that should have taken months was completed in just 72 hours. The three carriers, along with their escorts, departed Pearl Harbor in late May and early June, steaming northwest toward a position northeast of Midway, a location where they would be invisible to the approaching Japanese but perfectly positioned to strike when the enemy came within range. The American task force was commanded by two admirals of very different temperaments. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, flying his flag from the Yorktown, was the senior officer and overall commander. Fletcher was experienced, cautious, and still recovering from the inconclusive Battle of the Coral Sea, where his aggressive tactics had cost him the carrier USS Lexington. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the task force built around Enterprise and Hornet, was Fletcher's opposite, a quiet, methodical officer who had spent much of his career in staff positions and had never commanded carriers in combat. Spruance had been selected almost by accident. He had been filling in for Vice Admiral William Halsey, who was hospitalized with severe dermatitis. But Spruance would prove to be one of the finest tactical commanders in American naval history. The American force was significantly outnumbered. 3 carriers against 4. Approximately 230 aircraft against 250 Japanese. And the Japanese aircraft and pilots were, on paper, superior. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter was faster and more maneuverable than anything the Americans could field. Japanese pilots were veterans with years of combat experience in China and months of operations since Pearl Harbor. American pilots, many of them fresh from training, had far less experience. But the Americans had 2 advantages that would prove decisive. They knew the Japanese were coming, and they knew approximately where and when. The Japanese, by contrast, had no idea that American carriers were anywhere near Midway. On Midway Atoll, the garrison prepared for the attack they knew was coming. Nimitz had reinforced the island's defenses, sending additional aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, and marines. The aircraft based on Midway, a mix of obsolete fighters, patrol bombers, and B-17 heavy bombers, would not be a match for the Japanese in air combat, but they could contribute to the defense and, critically, they could scout for the approaching Japanese fleet. The tension on Midway in late May and early June was palpable. Everyone knew an attack was coming. Defensive positions were reinforced. Aircraft were dispersed to minimize damage from airstrikes. Supplies were stockpiled. And the garrison waited. On the morning of June 3rd, American patrol aircraft spotted elements of the Japanese fleet approaching from the west. But these were ships from the invasion force, not the carriers. The American commanders held their position, waiting for the main carrier force to reveal itself. Then, in the early morning darkness of June 4th, more patrol aircraft were launched from Midway, sweeping the ocean to the northwest. At 5:34 a.m., one of these aircraft, a PBY Catalina flying boat, radioed a message that electrified the American fleet. Enemy carriers. The Japanese carrier force had been located, approximately 200 miles northwest of Midway. The trap was about to be sprung. At 4:30 a.m., the Japanese carriers had launched their first strike against Midway, 108 aircraft aimed at neutralizing the island's defenses and clearing the way for the invasion force. The attack hit Midway shortly after 6:30 a.m., bombing and strafing the island's facilities. American anti-aircraft fire was intense, and several Japanese aircraft were shot down, but the attack inflicted significant damage. However, the Japanese strike commander, Lieutenant Joikai Tominaga, radioed back to the carriers with an ominous message: there is need for a second attack wave. The defenses on Midway had not been sufficiently suppressed. Another strike would be required. This message created a dilemma for Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai from the carrier Akagi. Nagumo had held back a second wave of aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, weapons designed for attacking ships, not land targets. These aircraft were on the carrier's hangar decks, ready to launch if American ships appeared. Now Tominaga was requesting another strike on Midway, which would require rearming these aircraft with general-purpose bombs suitable for attacking land targets. Nagumo faced a decision: keep the aircraft armed for ships, or rearm them for a second strike on Midway. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made his decision. He ordered the aircraft rearmed for a strike on Midway. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs were removed and stacked on the hangar decks. General-purpose bombs were brought up and loaded onto the aircraft. It was a time-consuming process, and it left the hangar decks cluttered with high explosives. But at 7:28 a.m., just 13 minutes after Nagumo had ordered the rearming, a Japanese scout aircraft radioed a message that changed everything. Enemy surface ships sighted. American ships. Ships that should not be there. Ships that Japanese intelligence had assured Nagumo were hundreds of miles away. And shortly after, a clarification: enemy ships appeared to be accompanied by a carrier. Nagumo was thunderstruck. An American carrier. Here. Now. How was that possible? Nagumo now faced a desperate situation. His aircraft were being rearmed for a land strike when he needed them armed for a naval strike. The first wave attacking Midway was returning, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. American aircraft from Midway were approaching, waves of uncoordinated attacks by torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and B-17s that were largely ineffective but forced the Japanese to maneuver and defend themselves. And somewhere to the northeast, American carriers were preparing to launch their own strikes. Nagumo made another decision. He would recover the Midway strike force first, allowing them to land, refuel, and rearm. Then he would launch a coordinated, powerful strike against the American carriers. It would take time, perhaps an hour, perhaps more, but it would ensure maximum effectiveness. On the American carriers, the Japanese position had been plotted. Admiral Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, made an aggressive decision. He would launch his strike immediately, even though it meant the aircraft would be at the extreme limit of their combat radius. If he waited to get closer, the Japanese might spot his carriers. If he waited for perfect coordination between his three carriers, the Japanese might launch their own strike first. At 7 a.m., even before the Japanese scout had reported the American carriers, Spruance began launching. Enterprise and Hornet sent up 116 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. Yorktown, under Fletcher's command, held back temporarily to maintain a defensive reserve, then launched its own strike force of 35 aircraft around 8:30 a.m. The American strike groups flew northwest, searching for the Japanese fleet. But coordination was poor. The different squadrons became separated. Some flew too far north and missed the Japanese entirely. Others arrived at different times. The carefully planned strike was dissolving into a series of uncoordinated attacks. And yet, this chaos would prove to be precisely what was needed. At 9:20 a.m., the Japanese carriers completed recovering the Midway strike force. All four carriers now had their decks packed with aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, all fueled, all armed, ready to launch against the American carriers. In 15 minutes, perhaps 20, the strike would begin launching. The Americans would face the full fury of the WWII. But they would never get the chance. Between 9:20 a.m. and 10:20 a.m., a span of just 1 hour, the Battle of Midway would be decided. In that single hour, 4 of the most powerful aircraft carriers in the world would be reduced to burning wrecks. Hundreds of aircraft would be destroyed. Thousands of men would die. And the course of the Pacific War would be irrevocably altered. It would be one of the most dramatic hours in naval history. And it would begin with tragedy and sacrifice. The first American aircraft to locate the Japanese carriers were the torpedo bombers, specifically Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet, flying obsolete TBD Devastator aircraft. Led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, the 15 aircraft of VT-8 spotted the Japanese fleet at approximately 9:20 a.m. and immediately pushed into their attack run. The TBD Devastator was slow, vulnerable, and required a long, straight approach at low altitude to drop its torpedo effectively. The Japanese, seeing the American torpedo bombers coming, scrambled their Zero fighters and maneuvered their ships to avoid the torpedoes. What followed was slaughter. Japanese Zeros dove on the lumbering American torpedo bombers, guns blazing. One after another, the Devastators were shot down. They crashed into the sea in flames. They exploded in mid-air. Within minutes, all 15 aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8 were destroyed. Only one man survived, Ensign George Gay, who clung to a floating seat cushion in the water and watched the rest of the battle unfold from his ringside seat in the ocean. Not a single torpedo from VT-8 hit its target. The attack was, in tactical terms, a complete failure. But more torpedo bombers were coming. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown arrived at the Japanese fleet minutes after VT-8 and pressed home their own attacks with the same suicidal courage and the same devastating results. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, 35 were shot down. Of the 127 aircrew aboard those aircraft, only 20 survived. It was one of the most one-sided, costly attacks in naval aviation history. The American torpedo squadrons had been decimated. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The torpedo bomber attacks had done something crucial. They had drawn the Japanese Zero fighters down to sea level. The Zeros, protecting the carriers from the low-altitude torpedo attacks, were now at low altitude themselves, climbing back up to regain altitude and position. Their fuel was running low. Some were landing to rearm and refuel. And at that precise moment, at approximately 10:20 a.m., American dive bombers arrived high above the Japanese fleet. 2 squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6 from Enterprise, had been searching for the Japanese fleet and had finally spotted it minutes earlier. Led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the dive bombers climbed to 19,000 feet and then, seeing the Japanese carriers below them with their decks packed with aircraft being prepared for launch, pushed over into their dives. The SBD Dauntless had perforated dive brakes that created a distinctive, terrifying shriek as the aircraft plummeted toward its target. To the Japanese sailors on the carriers below, looking up and seeing dozens of American dive bombers plunging toward them out of the sun, the sound must have been apocalyptic. McCluskey's squadron split their attack between two carriers, Kaga and Akagi. The dive bombers released their 1,000-pound bombs at low altitude, some dropping from as low as 1,500 feet, to ensure accuracy. Multiple bombs struck both carriers in rapid succession. On Kaga, 3 or 4 bombs hit within seconds. One penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, where aircraft loaded with fuel and bombs were parked. The secondary explosions were massive, tearing through the ship. Fires erupted that would never be controlled. Within minutes, Kaga was a blazing wreck. Akagi, the flagship, was struck by a single bomb that penetrated to the hangar deck and detonated among the aircraft being armed for the strike on the American carriers. The hangar was packed with torpedoes, bombs, and fuel that had been removed from aircraft during the earlier rearming operation. The resulting explosion and fire gutted the ship. Admiral Nagumo and his staff were forced to evacuate the flagship, transferring to a cruiser to continue directing the battle. And almost simultaneously, dive bombers from Yorktown, bombing Squadron 3, which had become separated from McCluskey's group and arrived independently, attacked the carrier Sarayu. 3 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession, starting fires that quickly spread through the ship. Like Kaga and Akagi, Sarayu was doomed. In the space of approximately 5 minutes, from 10:22 a.m. to 10:27 a.m., 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had been fatally damaged. The WWII, the elite carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had ranged across the Pacific with seeming impunity for 6 months, had been crippled. The aircraft that were supposed to strike the American carriers were destroyed on the decks or in the hangars before they could launch. The bombs and torpedoes that were supposed to sink American ships detonated aboard Japanese carriers, destroying them from within. The battle had been decided in 5 minutes by a combination of courage, timing, and sheer fortune. But one Japanese carrier remained undamaged, Hiryu. This carrier, positioned slightly apart from the other 3, had not been attacked during the American dive bomber strikes. And now, with the rest of the WWII burning, Hiryu's captain, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, ordered his aircraft to strike back. At 10:40 a.m., Hiryu launched a strike force of 18 dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. Their target, the American carriers that had inflicted such devastating damage on the Japanese fleet. The Japanese strike, guided by reconnaissance aircraft that had maintained contact with the American fleet, located USS Yorktown shortly after noon. American fighters rose to intercept, but several Japanese dive bombers broke through and scored hits on the carrier. 3 bombs struck Yorktown, penetrating the flight deck and starting fires. The ship's boilers were knocked offline. Yorktown slowed, then stopped, dead in the water. But American damage control crews, some of the best in the world, worked frantically. Within 2 hours, they had the fires under control, had restored power to 1 boiler, and had Yorktown moving again at 90 knots. The ship was damaged but still operational. But Hiryu was not finished. At 1:30 p.m., the Japanese carrier launched a second strike, 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. This strike also located Yorktown and pressed home its attack despite intense anti-aircraft fire and defending fighters. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier, flooding multiple compartments and knocking out power completely. This time, the damage was too severe. Yorktown listed heavily to port. The captain, fearing the ship might capsize and trap men below, gave the order to abandon ship. Sailors slid down ropes into the oil-covered water and were picked up by escorting destroyers. Yorktown remained afloat, listing but not sinking, a massive hulk floating alone in the Pacific. But even as Yorktown was being abandoned, American commanders were planning their response. The location of Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, had been reported by scout aircraft. Admiral Spruance, now effectively in overall command with Fletcher's flagship out of action, ordered a strike from Enterprise. At 3:30 p.m., 24 dive bombers from Enterprise located Hiryu and attacked. 4 bombs struck the carrier, starting fires that quickly spread. Like the other Japanese carriers, Hiryu's hangar decks were filled with fuel, ammunition, and aircraft. The fires could not be controlled. By evening, Hiryu was a burning hulk, abandoned by her crew. By the evening of June 4, 1942, all 4 carriers of the WWII were either sunk or burning. Kaga sank in the evening. Tsuraiu went down shortly after 7 p.m. Akagi and Hiryu, both too damaged to save, were scuttled by Japanese destroyers the next morning to prevent their capture. With them went 248 aircraft and, more critically, hundreds of pilots, mechanics, and aircrew, the experienced veterans who had formed the core of Japanese naval aviation. These men were irreplaceable. Japan could build new carriers, though it would take years. But the experienced aircrews, the veterans of Pearl Harbor and the campaigns in Southeast Asia, could not be replaced. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding from his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles to the west, received the reports of the disaster with shock and disbelief. His carefully planned operation had collapsed catastrophically. The American carriers, which were supposed to be lured into a trap and destroyed, had instead ambushed and destroyed the WWII. Yamamoto considered continuing the operation. He still had battleships, cruisers, and submarines, and the Americans had only 2 operational carriers remaining. Perhaps a night surface action could turn the tide. But as he assessed the situation, reality set in. Without air cover, his surface ships would be vulnerable to American air attack at dawn. Without the element of surprise, the invasion of Midway was impossible. The operation had failed. On June 5, Yamamoto issued the order to withdraw. The Japanese fleet turned west, heading back toward Japan. The Battle of Midway was over. There would be a tragic coda to the battle. On June 6, a Japanese submarine I-168 located the abandoned but still floating USS Yorktown under tow by a salvage tug. The submarine fired a spread of torpedoes, hitting both Yorktown and the destroyer USS Hammond, which was alongside providing power for salvage operations. Hammond sank within minutes. Yorktown, her hull torn open by the torpedo hits, finally sank on the morning of June 7th. The battle was over. The cost had been high on both sides, but overwhelmingly borne by Japan. The Japanese had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,057 killed. The Americans had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 killed. But beyond the numbers lay the strategic reality. The battle had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. And nothing would ever be the same. In the days following the Battle of Midway, as the full extent of the Japanese losses became clear, the strategic implications of the battle began to dawn on both sides. For Japan, Midway was not just a tactical defeat, it was a catastrophe that fundamentally undermined their strategic position in the Pacific. The loss of 4 fleet carriers was staggering, but it was the loss of the experienced aircrew that was truly irreplaceable. Japan had entered the war with approximately 3,500 trained naval aviators. The losses at Midway, combined with casualties from earlier battles, had gutted this force. New pilots could be trained, but they would lack the combat experience of the veterans who had been lost. Japanese naval aviation would never again achieve the proficiency it had possessed in December 1941. Moreover, Japan's industrial capacity could not quickly replace the lost carriers. Building a fleet carrier took 2 to 3 years, even in peacetime. Japan would eventually commission new carriers, but by the time they entered service, the Americans would have built many more. The United States, with its vastly superior industrial capacity, was already laying down multiple new Essex-class carriers that would enter service in 1943 and 1944. Ships that would overwhelm any Japanese response. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had shifted. Before Midway, Japan had been advancing, capturing territory, expanding its empire. After Midway, Japan would be on the defensive, struggling to hold what it had taken, bleeding strength in a war of attrition it could not win. For the United States, Midway was vindication, proof that American codebreakers, commanders, and fighting men could match and defeat the Japanese despite inferior numbers and less experienced crews. The victory boosted morale at home and in the fleet. It demonstrated that Pearl Harbor had not been a fatal blow, that American naval power could recover and strike back decisively. Admiral Nimitz, whose confidence in his intelligence officers had enabled the ambush, became the architect of America's Pacific strategy. His approach would be methodical, island-hopping across the Pacific, bypassing strong Japanese positions, seizing key islands that could serve as bases for the next advance. Each operation would push closer to Japan itself, tightening the noose around the empire. But for the men who fought at Midway, on both sides, the battle was deeply personal. For American survivors like Ensign George Gay, who watched Torpedo Squadron 8 annihilated while he floated in the water, or the pilots of the dive bomber squadrons who delivered the decisive blows, Midway was a mixture of triumph and tragedy. They had won a great victory, but many of their comrades had died achieving it. For Japanese survivors, Midway was a trauma that many never fully processed. The speed of the disaster, 4 carriers lost in minutes, seemed incomprehensible. How had the mighty Kido Butai been destroyed so quickly? Survivors struggled to explain it, even to themselves. In the broader context of World War II, Midway stands as one of the decisive battles of the war, not because it ended the conflict, the war would continue for 3 more years, but because it marked the point where Japan's offensive capability was broken. After Midway, Japan would fight defensively, never again able to mount the kind of offensive operations that had characterized the first 6 months of the war. Just 2 months after Midway, American forces would land on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning the long, costly campaign up the Solomon chain. The pattern established at Guadalcanal, American forces seizing territory, Japan counterattacking fiercely but unable to dislodge them, would repeat across the Pacific. Each battle would cost both sides dearly, but America could sustain its losses while Japan could not. Historians have debated the Battle of Midway for decades. Was the American victory primarily due to superior intelligence? To Japanese mistakes, the rearming of aircraft, the failure to launch a coordinated strike earlier? To the courage and sacrifice of the American torpedo squadrons? To sheer luck, the American dive bombers arriving at exactly the moment when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable? In the end, the losses were decisive. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the heart of the Kido Butai, sunk, along with hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. The stunning victory at Midway was not just revenge for Pearl Harbor, it was a fundamental, permanent reversal of fortune. Japan's ability to wage an offensive war was crippled forever. The United States seized the strategic initiative and would hold it until the final day of the war. Midway proved that in the age of air power, the carrier, and the intelligence network supporting it, ruled the seas. The war in the Pacific would continue for 3 more brutal years, but the turning point had been reached. If you want to understand how intelligence, luck, and tactical brilliance converge to create defining historical moments, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, do you believe the US Navy would have survived the battle without the crucial advantage provided by the code-breaking team at Station Hypo? Thanks for watching.